our speaker tonight is a relatively new friend of mine, Ted Gilman. Ted and I met last year, and I invited him to visit Oklahoma State University. Where he's currently at, Harvard University, is a little different. And so we thought this would be a great cross-cultural experience. And he's been telling people across campus this is like study abroad for him. So he's had a relatively nice time while he's here. And we took him to the Boone Pickens celebration yesterday. And that was an experience. So, but anyway, we're delighted to have Ted here. He is a graduate of Tufts University, as well as the University of Michigan, where he got his PhD in political science. Ted was at Union College for a number of years, and most recently was at Harvard as director of the Reischauer Institute for Japanese Studies, and is currently the executive director for the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, which is the umbrella organization that supports internationally oriented research at Harvard University. He's been in that role for 5 years. So he's got a great perspective on what's happening around the world. We did a taped interview with him today that will go online in a couple of days, where he talks a little bit more in depth about some of those issues that we'll, if you're on our email list, we'll make sure we send that out to you. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ted Gilman.
Thanks, Randy. Thanks, Randy. I am so happy to be here, and I came in, let's see, today's Thursday. I came in yesterday, and I've met a whole bunch of people already. It's been a wonderful couple of days, and this is just the most incredibly energizing community. You guys are really lucky. And I've really enjoyed my stay here, and I'm even more excited that I get to stay through the football game on Saturday. Yeah, and so, football, as Randy said, there are differences between our two universities. Football is one of the big ones. We do have football. I couldn't tell you anything about the team, however, but I am looking forward to Saturday. So my plan tonight is to talk for about 30, 40 minutes and then open it up to questions. My sense of this group is that there are people here who know a lot about Asia and might want to have something to say and might want to start a discussion, so I'm looking forward to that. I also am trying out, this is sort of a new talk for me, in part because so much has happened in East Asia recently that when you talk about Asia, it's really hard to go back to the canned, tried and true material. Just in the last couple of days, there are things in the news that I thought, well, should I stick this in here? But I didn't quite go that recent. But really, this is going to be a current events talk, and I'm really excited to share it with you. And any suggestions or comments or ideas that you have at the end, I'd love to hear them. So don't hold back. Okay, let's start off with bilateral relationships. All right, we're talking about a really complicated topic here, and one of the worst questions I get sometimes, I'll be on an airplane and someone will say, "What do you do?" And I'll say, "Well, this is what I do," what Randy described, and they'll say, "Oh, what should I know about East Asia?" And I kind of go, "Well, this is only a 4-hour flight." I don't have time to really share that with you. So what I'm going to try to do today is give you the highlights of what I think is important right now in a very complicated area. And a lot of it is, we can start talking about the bilateral relationships that we have before us. And obviously, so we can get the players straight, on the left side, we have our president and Xi Jinping of China, and then our president and Kim Jong-un of North Korea. Here we have, there are summits that don't involve the United States, although you may not hear about them in the American media. Here we have Kim and President Xi, and then the guy with President Trump there is the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. There have been a lot of these kinds of meetings in the last couple of years. And as a result, there's a lot of communication at the highest levels, but there's also a lot of energy pushed down into the level of government-to-government relations, and even below that in terms of popular connections among the countries. How about this relationship? How about President Abe on the right and President Moon of South Korea? And this is a relationship that I'm going to save until the end of the talk, because of all the things that are going on in Asia, this is the one that troubles me right now the most, and I'll tell you why. But I do want to focus on the complexity of the power relations in East Asia. It's complicated. There is something for everyone. I was describing it to my son, who's a junior in college, who doesn't care at all about international relations, but wanted to know what I was going to talk about. And he kind of rolled his eyes, and he said, "Dad, what you're describing is like the cable TV lineup of international relations." I said, "What do you mean by that?" And he said, "Well, cable TV, it's like this endless menu, and you can find something to watch. Whatever you're interested in watching, you can find some of that." And I thought, wow, at first I thought you're being cheeky guy, but actually he was right. And I said, he said, if you want to find countries that are collaborating, you can find that. If you want to find conflict, you can find that. If you want to find trade and increasing connections, economic connections, you can find that. And likewise, if you want protectionism, you can find that. So there's something for everyone. It's really hard to generalize. So you can see and watch what you want on the cable TV menu in East Asia. But one of the things that does characterize this area is a remarkable amount of stability since the Korean War. Okay? Since the end of the conflict in 1953, there has been very little military activity in the area. And even after the Cold War, there was some anxiety about what would happen, with sort of the shifting of a bipolar system into more of a unipolar system. I wouldn't call it an exclusively unipolar system, but we had Russia trying to take the place of the Soviet Union and really not doing what the Soviet Union had done. Is this going to continue? Are we seeing a change right now because of various factors? And that's a question that I hope to have you thinking about for the next few minutes, and also as you walk out of here. My perspective on this, I am not coming at this from an American perspective, although, yeah, I am an American, but I tend to view this as, I think of myself as a regional analyst. So I'm advocating for regional stability. Why do I think stability in the region is important? When this region is stable, good things happen for the people who live here, right? I mean, you get better quality of life, better standard of living, less poverty, and so there's an old saying that is often attributed to Lee Kuan Yew, who was the president of Singapore. When two elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers, right? Okay, so you don't want to have that conflict because it's the people on the ground who suffer. But then there's also the corollary part of that, the second part of that, that when two elephants make love, it is also the grass that suffers, which I'm not sure if President Lee said that part, but I kind of like it anyway, because it does suggest that when there is conflict and when there's tension, resources can flow, from powerful countries to less powerful countries. When things are calm, maybe there's not as much resource transfer. Let's talk a little bit about this triangle of power, or balance. I think of it as a triangle. It's a triangle, but it's not an equilateral triangle. The US and Japan are much closer together to each other than they are to China. And basically, the dynamic of this triangle is that Japan and the United States work to get China to make responsible choices. The two industrialized democracies try and integrate China into the system, but they hedge their bets. So trust China, but also be cautious. China was invited to join the World Trade Organization in 2001, thereby bringing it into the international trading regime. trade leverage is important, right? Companies from these other two countries invest in China, that creates jobs, that increases standards of living, that provides cheap goods and trade for those of us who live in one of the two industrialized democracies. And overall, it's a win-win-win situation. But at the same time that the trade is happening, security is still maintained at a very high level. 50,000 US troops in Japan, are part of a potential deterrent to any bad behavior that China tries to do, anything that China tries to do. And the cost of those Americans in Japan is borne largely by the Japanese. They pay roughly three quarters of the basing costs for our troops over there. So all of this kind of trade with, but also have a strong defense, keeps the Chinese from behaving in a way that might destabilize the region. I would argue that the Sino-Japanese relationship is getting better these days. It has not always been particularly good, okay? There are plenty of cases in history, situations in history, where Japan did really terrible things in China, right? There was having Japan invaded Korea and China, kept parts of China and all of Korea as a colony. Getting past that episode of colonialism is really hard, and it rears its head again and again in the media, in education, in diplomacy. So, everyone is always aware of the historical background that challenges these two countries. And in 2012, something happened that really was kind of surprising. There is a small set of islands called the Japanese call them the Senkaku Islands. The Chinese call them the Diaoyutai. And I apologize for that pronunciation because I know it's horrible. But I come from the Japan side, so I'm going to use the Japanese word. The Senkaku Islands are this small set of islands. You can see a picture of them up there. In 2012, ownership of these islands, which are very remote, nobody lives there, and basically they stake out territory. It's like planting a flag in the ocean that demarcates a place where you have fishing rights and shipping rights and other kinds and possible mineral rights, but it's a provocative position to claim these islands based on where they are. The Japanese national government transferred ownership of these little islands to the local government that runs the city of Tokyo. Yeah, that's sort of like, I don't know, we're kind of far from an ocean here, so I don't know what analogy works. But to have the national government take a very politically sensitive piece of territory and transfer it to a local government seemed totally out of whack from an international relations perspective. From the Japanese perspective, it made really good sense because there already is another set of really small islands about 1,000 miles due south of Tokyo in the middle of the Pacific. It is close to literally nothing, called the Ogasawara Islands. And those are considered part of metropolitan Tokyo, and they are administered by the metropolitan Tokyo government. So the metropolitan Tokyo government already had experience running remote islands, and this was going to be even easier because nobody lives on these islands. On the Ogasawara Islands, they have a population, they have to provide schools, they have to provide transportation and medical care and all the stuff that humans need. So from Tokyo's perspective, this made sense, okay? And it's kind of like, there is some precedent for this. If you look in the Caribbean, there are French islands in the Caribbean that are considered parts of the Parisian local government. So it's not like totally out of the imagination to do this. With the Senkaku Islands transferred to Tokyo's control, the Chinese protested because they claim it as their own. And how could you transfer our own territory to the local government of your capital? that didn't fly well. And people say, oh, we're ratcheting up the tension between China and Japan. A year later, China responded by establishing an Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone over portions of the East China Sea. This is a zone where you must, as an aircraft flying through there, you can't fly through silently. You have to be broadcasting your identity, what country you're from. You have to have a registered identification number. And this had not existed in this region before. And it was sort of China's response to, okay, if you're going to claim territory, island territory, we are going to claim air space. And it was a tit for tat kind of behavior. And people who analyzed the region said, oh, look at this. You know, now the other side is ratcheting up the conflict. And it kind of sat there for a while, and the Japanese responded with a little bit of increase in their defense budget, which they hadn't done for 7 or 8 years. But it wasn't a huge increase, and Japan already has a ginormous defense budget anyway. They're one of the top 10 spenders on defense in the world. And then in 2016, Chinese ships made a very public and very visible intrusion into the waters around the Senkaku Islands. And at the same time they did this, so they sailed ships into the area where these islands are, at the very same time, the Chinese government was working to promote foreign direct investment and free trade with Japan and South Korea. So they're sending a mixed message. They're like, we want, you know, these are our islands, but we also want to maintain good relations. As a country, you know, how do you interpret that? You know, what do you do in that situation? And the answer is, it's complicated. And you have different parts of your government saying, hey, look, this is an opportunity to be friends. And then another part of the government is saying, hey, look, this is an opportunity for us. This is a time when we should be careful and we should really use caution. Instead of the situation, though the situation could have gone either way, it actually moved in the direction of improved relations. The intrusion by the Chinese ships was kind of, it wasn't talked about too much. The policymakers and spokespeople for the government talked much more about the foreign direct investment opportunities and the trade opportunities with China. And then in 2017, President Xi and Prime Minister Abe, the Chinese and Japanese prime ministers, prime minister, had summit meetings, once in China and once in Japan. And that was the signal that overall things are much better and they get along on a personal level. Xi came to China, Abe went to Japan. They had a normal, constructive dialogue, which was communicated to the people who negotiate between the countries. And both countries came away from that saying, you know, we see trade as reinforcing security, and it's quite stable between these countries, and the rule of law in the region is important, and all the right things. So even though there was potential here for conflict, it's turning out okay. And I'm very optimistic about, you know, I've sometimes been asked, you know, do you worry about China? And I think, no, I don't worry about China at all. You know, there are other parts of this story that I worry about. How about US-Japan relations? How about that selfie? So yeah, I know it's. I'm not sure who comes off looking more goofy in that picture, but it's a good one. And so Abe is a golfer, and obviously you know that President Trump is a golfer as well. For those of you who've been around East Asia for a while, you may know that back in the 1970s, when the US and China were first starting to have diplomatic relations, there was something called ping pong diplomacy. And teams of ping pong players, table tennis players, were sent to China from the US, to the US from China, and it was a way to kind of break the ice. To some extent, Abe is practicing golf cart diplomacy. I mean, obviously the relationship is already solid, already strong, but Abe manages Trump really well. He manages Trump better than anybody else I can think of, in part because he's played golf with him more than anybody else has. You know, can you think of any other leaders that go out on the golf course with Trump? It's really kind of a simple thing, but it helps. It really seems to work. And it keeps the relationship solid. Trade relations are great at a time when Trump is sometimes looking at stable relationships around the world and saying, well, maybe we should reconsider that, and well, maybe it's time for other places to pay their fair share. Japan seems somewhat exempt from this kind of behavior and this kind of treatment. And people who are close to Abe say that he's going to keep on doing this. And every time they get together, golf is on the agenda. It's absolutely going to happen. Oh, I figured I'd share this with you. This is a picture of, from the Japanese media, obviously, of a recent time when they were playing golf together. And Abe fell backwards into one of the bunkers. And so this didn't get a lot of play in the US, and it was kind of irreverently laughed at in Japan. This is what you get for, going out on the golf course and doing diplomacy, is sometimes you come away, on your backside. But there is some concern that the US is pulling back from East Asia. And one of the indications that the US might be pulling back from its years of commitment and effort in stability is the US response to North Korean, DPRK is Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Okay, so the North Korean missile tests that have happened several times over the last couple of years. And when these have happened, the rhetoric out of the White House has been, in the eyes of people in East Asia, forgiving. That the US has not taken a particularly hard line in responding to these missile launches. Well, people ask the president about it, he says, well, it wasn't really, Trump will say, it wasn't really a missile launch, or it wasn't really an intercontinental ballistic missile launch. It was a short-range missile launch, and that's okay. We're not worried about that. We may not be worried about that, but there are some countries that are really close to North Korea who do worry about that. And they are concerned about, hey, it's 1,000 miles is still pretty, it doesn't take a missile very long to fly 1,000 miles. Another indication that the US is possibly pulling back from East Asia is the way the US is treating China on trade. Upping the tariffs against China, renegotiating and trying to get Chinese buyers to buy more American products, things that are basically slowing down what is seen as the natural flow of trade in the relationship. And overall, trade is decreasing. Not a lot. I mean, there's still a lot of really good trade between China and the US, but it's a concern that there might be some weakness in the relationship. The fair share mentality is good, but how much do you get people to pay their fair share? How much security are you willing to give up in order so that people will pay their fair share? And how, what price security? So this is the question vis-a-vis China that the countries that we are closest to, Japan and South Korea, are asking. And so it leads to some, if the US pulls out of Asia, not pulls out all the way, but even reduces its commitment to Asia, what happens? What does East Asia do in a world where, or in a region where the US might not be as committed as it has been? And it leads to big questions for the Japanese in particular. Can the Japanese Self-Defense Force, SDF is Japan's self-defense force, Japan does not have a military in the traditional sense of the word, but they do have self-defense forces, which means they can defend, but they have extraordinarily limited force projection capability. What threats can they prepare for? What threats should they prepare for? Is Japan secure? Are they safe? North Korea can launch a missile over Japan, that keeps some policymakers in Tokyo up at night. And here you see some Japanese ground self-defense force troops deployed in a very sunny place in the Middle East. And one of the things you'll notice is they're not carrying sidearms, or they're not carrying rifles. And that's a standard thing in their deployments, is they very often only have small arms. They don't carry a larger rifle. So what happens? Japan's government is constrained by something called Article 9, which is part of the Japanese Constitution that was put in place in 1947 by the occupation forces led by US General Douglas MacArthur. And people talk about Article 9 and people reference Article 9, but I thought it might make sense to actually put Article 9 up here. This is the approved English translation of Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. As you can see, it's not that long. It's just two sentences essentially. And it basically says that Japan will not maintain land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, period. You can't be a belligerent. This has been interpreted since the day it was written to mean that they can have defensive forces. So no aircraft carriers, because aircraft carriers are about sending forces far away. But they can have top shelf defensive forces and defensive capabilities sold by the United States and approved and working in close collaboration with the American military, and they do. Well, what about nuclear? If you go back to this, there's nothing in here that says Japan couldn't have nuclear weapons. It just says you can't have the ability to be a belligerent, to start a war, to project power. But is there a defensive use for nuclear weapons? Can nuclear weapons be defensively deployed? No first strike capability, will only launch if launched upon, is a plausible way. And the Japanese defense policymakers have been thinking about this since the 1950s, okay, since really the nuclear arms race started to ramp up. The debate is alive today, but popular opinion is very much opposed, as you might imagine, to Japan having nuclear weapons for a couple of reasons. As the only country on the receiving end of a nuclear weapon, they are quite sensitive to that. And every year in Nagasaki, or in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there are very large, very public ceremonies condemning nuclear weapons. And every Japanese school child goes on a field trip to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and gets several days of education every year focused exclusively on peace. So there is a grassroots sentiment that nuclear weapons are not something Japan should have. A nuclear Japan definitely makes the neighbors nervous. Even an armed Japan makes China and North Korea and Russia uncomfortable. And a nuclear Japan would make those countries even less comfortable. But on a sort of strategic level, if you're going to have nuclear weapons, you really have to think about the logistics of that. Where do you put them? We're talking about a small island archipelago that's largely mountains. It's not an easy place to dig holes and hide missiles. It's really, really challenging to do that. It's not like the lovely plains of the central United States where, who knows where they are, but the ground is really easy to dig and we can dig lots of holes here. And Japan is not like that. So hiding these things would be very difficult and would make them more vulnerable than they might be in other countries. The Japanese who think this through, have said, well, if Japan is going to have nukes, they're going to have to put them on submarines. That submarine-launched missiles really provide the best combination of stealth and secrecy. But then where do you park them, and how do you, there's all kinds of logistical issues. And so at the end of the day, Japanese policy planners have said, we can rely on the deterrent capabilities of the United States, okay? Reliance on the US strategic umbrella works better for Japan than Japan having its own nuclear weapons. That said, this conversation is regularly had in Tokyo, and it's something that the Japanese think about. Should Japan have a retaliatory capability? If your neighbor has nuclear weapons and can reliably launch a missile towards you? Some would say in a world, in an anarchic system, which we have, there is no such thing as world government, there aren't laws or rules that countries follow, maybe Japan should do this. So something to think, something to talk about, and something that does get talked about. Here's another complicated triangle that I wanted to get you to think a little bit about. Okay? These countries, Japan, US, Korea, South Korea, they're all democracies, they're all leading industrialized economies. They are natural allies in this area. There are security treaties that bind the US to Korea, the US to South Korea, and the US to Japan. South Korea and Japan do not have a formal security treaty, but they do have a peace treaty, and there is a fair amount of cooperation between these. Are these three countries, whose interests until now have been quite harmonious, are they starting to see the world, their own security interests, a little differently? Here's the relationship I was a little worried about. It's the one between Tokyo and Seoul. Of course, the colonialism history comes up a lot. A peace treaty was signed in 1965 between these two countries, formally setting them on a path to peace. And yet, nationalism is a persistent issue in these two countries. When I say realism, I mean like the political science theory realism. I don't mean like a reality check. I'm saying, how do you balance against potential threats in the region? These two countries, by all measures, should not be fighting each other. They should not be in conflict. And yet, their relationship today is as bad as it's been for the last 50 years. In the 1965 peace treaty ended hostilities and said that all reparations for whatever behaviors Japan did in Korea are paid. Okay? Both countries signed it and agreed to it. But in Korea, there's been a steady effort to raise the issue of reparations and get Japan to pay more, and get Japan to apologize more, and get Japan to acknowledge more of what it did in Korea. How many of you have heard the term comfort women? Okay. So this is a form of sex slavery, basically, and forced sexual relations that Korean women were forced to have with Japanese troops, largely, when Korea was a colony of Japan. Has Japan apologized sufficiently for that treatment of Korean women? The Japanese would say yes. The Koreans would say absolutely not. And this has been debated back and forth, and gestures have been made on both sides, and it's an issue that just, it's a really intractable issue. And in 2011, kind of recent, the South Korean, ROK is Republic of Korea, the South Korean courts ordered Japanese companies that had been doing business in Japan during the colonial era. The Korean courts ordered Japanese companies to pay reparations to workers who had been basically enslaved and forced labor for those companies. 2011. But there's a peace treaty in 1965. But the courts mandated this to happen. But there's all this trade going on between the two. How are Japanese companies supposed to respond? Should they just pay it? Nothing was paid. And then in 2018, the courts, the South Korean courts took a further step and said that comfort women, in addition to forced labor, should be compensated for their exploitation, and that families of comfort women were also due compensation. So the Korean court system kept this issue alive until, as very recently, 2018. Japan, of course, rejected the Korean court decision, saying, no, this was settled in 1965. And then soon thereafter, Japan accused a South Korean naval vessel of targeting a Japanese military surveillance craft, lighting it up, as they say, with fire control radar, as if they were going to shoot at it. Now, this was unheard of, and people really sat up and took notice. In the past, such an overt conflict between Japan's self-defense force and the Korean military would have generated a response by the United States. But in 2018, the US would have in the past convened trilateral meetings, let's talk it through, let's de-escalate. This would have been managed. This time, it wasn't. And the US did not bring the two countries together and the relevant decision makers and policymakers together to talk about it. Soon after this fire control radar incident, there was a G20 summit that happened in Osaka, Japan. And though those smiling pictures of Abe with all these other leaders and Moon with all these other leaders were broadcast, no picture was taken with Abe and Moon, the South Korean and Japanese leaders, and they barely spoke to each other during the entire event. And people noticed. In 2019, a very technical thing happened, but it's significant, and so I want to share it with you. In 2019, the General Security of Military Information Agreement, General Security of Military Information Agreement, was ended by the South Koreans, at least vis-a-vis Japan. They decided they were not going to share classified or intelligence information with Tokyo. This was absolutely crucial information when North Korea was launching missile tests, because everybody had a certain amount of surveillance in the region, but nobody had complete coverage. And so, well, maybe the US did, but it's good to share when this kind of thing happens. And suddenly the Koreans and the Japanese, the two closest US allies, were not sharing intelligence information on these, wouldn't share it on these launches. It sent a signal around the region. It sent a signal to North Korea that the Japanese and the South Koreans were moving apart. It sent a signal to China that maybe a wedge could be driven between these two countries that are US allies. It signaled an opportunity for anybody that wanted to change the balance of power in East Asia. Interestingly, in South Korea, there was a very highly publicized poll once this information got out, and they polled South Korean voters, and 55% of South Koreans supported non-renewal of GSOMNIA. That was really stunning to have public support. 55% said that not sharing intelligence with Japan was either a good or very good decision. It took a lot of us by surprise. So now we sort of look at these emerging insecurity concerns. A recent joint air patrol by Russia and China on July 23rd of this year, the Russian and Chinese airplanes flew together, military planes flew together over the East China Sea. The Koreans saw the joint air patrol, and they fired warning shots. Not one warning shot, not two warning shots, but they fired several hundred warning shots toward the planes. Never in danger of hitting the planes, but it was a statement that, this is really shaking up people on the front lines in the region. What does it do to stability? How worried are we about this? Where is the United States that normally smooths such turbulence over? Is the US doing anything to smooth the turbulence? I haven't seen it. Is Washington calling for multilateral talks? Not so far, not in this area. There's a lot of posturing here for domestic audiences. The Korean government got a bump in popularity for firing warning shots at Chinese and Russian planes. The Chinese and Russians got some domestic political benefit from working together and flying together. But the US really didn't get any benefit or damage from this event. Now we see people saying quietly that maybe South Korea can defend itself. South Korea, when at the end of the Korean War, was a struggling economy. Now the South Korean economy is 50 times larger than the North Korean economy, 50 times. If US forces pulled out, maybe South Korea would be okay. The US's forces there are a tripwire on the Korean Peninsula that guarantee US intervention if an attack comes across from North Korea. But if South Korea could handle North Korea on its own, maybe the US doesn't need to be there. I would argue that we've got a good system in place, and although I'm inclined to do all kinds of things on the trade side to shake up relationships, all of that possible trade benefit is threatened by security instability or defense instability. It's a small investment for the United States to keep troops in South Korea. And the benefit of that investment is a calm mood and a calm atmosphere on a politically sensitive flashpoint in the world. So I would say I hope we don't see a pullback from the US here, but I'm a little bit worried that that might be in the cards. So thank you. All right. If you, I would love to open this up to questions and comments.
So if you have
I don't know what your normal
if you have a
procedures are.
question, raise your hand. I'll bring you the mic. We need to get you on the mic so that we can capture it on the video. So, and we've got about 20 minutes for questions.
Perfect.
So, anybody?
If you are going to ask a question, could you please just tell me your name and tell me your affiliation, how you're connected to all this? That would be helpful. Thanks.
I know this guy. I know this guy. Hold it. Okay. So, given that Japan is...
Hi, Zach.
Hi. Hi, I'm Zach.
Thank you. Yes.
Given that Japan has bad relationships with a lot of its neighbors, who do they look to as like their solid allies if a conflict did erupt between South Korea and Japan, or China and Japan?
The U.S. That relationship. Notice I didn't talk about pulling troops out of Japan. That the possibility of troops coming out of Korea is one thing, but the Japanese, Japan has an equal number of U.S. troops, about 50,000, stationed between mainland Japan and Okinawa, and no one is talking about moving those anywhere. So I think that is, that's a completely different conversation. And the Japanese are fine with that.
Hi, thank you for the reminder. I'm Mackenzie. I'm a second semester master's student in global studies, and I'm doing the communication track. So you said that South Korea got domestic benefit, political benefit from like firing the planes. What was their reasoning for doing that? I mean, besides like we don't like what you did, or is there some like almost like a demand or a request, or is it just sort of like we don't like you and that's what we're just saying, you know?
This was the South Korean response was thank you, good question. The South Korean response was to a perceived violation of airspace and to see military aircraft of another country in their airspace. They felt it, or heading toward their airspace, they felt it warranted this response. I don't think anybody said, wow, this is going to go over really well with the populace. At that point in time, that's not part of the calculus. But in the aftermath, when media agencies start polling people, then you get the, oh yeah, and for a government that is always a little bit precariously supported, this was a way for the government to get some extra bonus points. Yeah.
My name is Belém, and I'm also a student here at the Global Studies program.
Hi.
And I have like two questions. I would like to hear your opinion about the future with South Korea and Japan. And do you think that U.S. will intervene when maybe some trade issues start to affect, the supplies from South Korea? I don't know, the chips or the chemical or, that is my...
Okay, let me take the second question first. So would the U.S. intervene if the trade restrictions between South Korea and Japan start to get ratcheted up? I think what we're seeing is the trade restrictions already are being ratcheted up, and this is a real problem because the supply chain for some, advanced electronics and other high-end industries of Japanese companies that supply chain runs through Korea. And I don't see the U.S. intervening in that sort of trade dispute. That's not the way the U.S. generally responds. That is something that would be well negotiated between Japanese trade bureaucrats and their South Korean counterparts. And I expect them to be able to work it out quite quietly and effectively, but I would guess it's going to take a year or so, assuming we don't get any worse relationships on the security side. The relationship between South Korea and Japan in the future is a big question. How much in the future? Neither one of these countries is going to benefit from radical change in a very short amount of time. They both benefit from the status quo. Big business benefits from the current situation. Big business is a strong political interest group, and so big companies on both sides are going to encourage caution before any changes happen. So I'm hopeful that in this case, economic interests will win out and things should stay the course. I don't expect them to ever come to any sort of military. The actual military forces are too close, and they do enough exchange and they do enough interaction that South Korea-Japan conflict, military conflict, is very, very, very unlikely.
My name is Ben. I'm also in the Global Studies program. I love the way you ended the presentation by saying that the trade benefits may somehow be overshadowed with any military aggression. I look at the U.S. Position in that region before now to be very strategic.
Yep.
And then I know that one administration to the other, they've always kept that strategic position.
Yep.
Is there a clear-cut foreign policy in that region right now with the current administration in the U.S.?
I was hoping. I almost got there, didn't I? And first of all, may I say that you absolutely win shirt of the night. And Ben, please stand up and show everybody. I think that if Global Studies is looking for a campus identity, everybody should be wearing that shirt when it comes to, I certainly would wear one if I had one. So I love it. Thank you. And thank you for being such a good sport about that. It's a world map if you couldn't see from across the room. So is there a clear-cut policy vis-a-vis East Asia? Yes. I'm not sure, I'm not certain that the president necessarily is aware of the clear-cut policy, but I know for a fact that the people within the various agencies and the career civil servants who work on this stuff and who interact absolutely have a policy. And it's basically one that we've been following, whether the administrations are Republican or Democrat, for decades. And it's, continued peace, continued trade, continued thick interaction between the countries that benefits the most people. And I'm very, comfortable with that. I will say that, when it's really interesting, and I was just talking with the Japanese, the number 2 at the Japanese embassy in Beijing is on our campus for the year. And so he and I have had a bunch of conversations, and I've known him for 25 years. And he's the one who really paints this picture of contrast between what the leadership says and does and what happens embassy to embassy. And his example, he talks about the trade issue. And he says, why is the US going it alone trying to get China to be a more fair trading partner? The interests of Western European countries, the interests of Japan and South Korea are 100% in line with the American interests on this issue. We want protection of intellectual property. We want, free and fair trade. And yet, at the presidential level, we don't see a recognition of that shared interest. But what this guy from the Japanese embassy said is, of course, at the embassy level, they see this every day, and they know this is the case. And so they have really not changed the way, they just kind of ignore on this particular issue whatever is happening in the media, and they keep working with, so the Japanese are working with the Americans and the Western Europeans to try and get China to be a more open and fair trading partner. And so that's one of those, it's a weird thing to see government officials maybe doing a different path than the leadership. We have this faith, we in the United States anyway, have this idea that those two pieces of government should be in lockstep. But I think in other countries, that's not always the case. And we could learn a lot from, the Americans could learn a lot from other countries in maybe seeing some distance between that. That help? Yeah, okay.
So I'm Alexandria, another
Hello.
student of the Global Studies program.
Guys are everywhere.
Well, this is our building,
Oh,
so
that's right.
we like to live here.
That's right.
So in the past couple years, I've noticed, yes, North Korea has been in the news for negative things, but
Yep.
they've kind of started to try to counteract that a bit.
Yeah.
A few years ago, they invited YouTubers to a resort in North Korea for propaganda purposes, of course.
Of course.
But they let video out of that region and all the people that live there. So what do you see the future of the North Korean regime? Do you think they're going to follow China way back in the day when they finally started opening up a little bit to the West and move from that communist to more of a capitalistic world?
Okay.
Or do you think it's going to...
Oh, Alexandria, thank you so much for recognizing that hole that I left in the presentation, because I could have gone on all night and something had to give, so thank you for picking that up. I would say that I am more optimistic about North Korea now than I have been in a really long time, for a couple of reasons. First of all, Kim Jong-un has proved to be an extraordinarily rational actor. And there are times where people have said, oh, this guy's crazy, we don't know what he's going to do. But now that we've seen him, moving forward with these missile tests and with relations with Trump and with, moving closer to Beijing, he's actually doing exactly what, it looks like makes sense. There's a coherent policy or a coherent set of behaviors coming out of there, which makes him a little bit predictable and which makes it easier to sleep at night, because predictability is a healthy thing. You want to not be the loose cannon, or you want your neighbors to not be loose cannons. They still have so far to go in terms of feeding the population of, food security is just such a huge issue there. But the more time he spends talking with the countries that we've been talking about this evening, the more aid is going to trickle towards the North. And I think that's a good thing. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I can't say that he's going to open up tomorrow and we're all going to be going to Trump resorts on the coast, which I think would be, actually might do a lot for stability in the region, although that would be a really hard thing for me to swallow personally. But it would be an interesting thing. So I think we're going to be okay there. Yeah.
One more question.
Hello, my name is Adolfo. I'm from the Global Studies program as well. Japan being a key ally of the United States, well, that's the way it is now,
Yep.
but it was a big problem and it hurt the U.S. bad in its day. So would you say Japan is obedient to the United States, or do they like the United States genuinely at heart? Or are they obedient because they know you are stronger and they have learned to respect that? And are there public diplomacy efforts underway, say, with children, as is the teaching of peace, for example, with Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Does the U.S. see it an importance to work from youth and friendship, closeness, and trust from the Japanese population?
Interesting question. Public diplomacy. Certainly the U.S. has no special, keep Japan our friend policy, because the U.S. doesn't need one. Japan, the interests of the two countries are sufficiently aligned that I don't think you have to work hard to keep that relationship solid. Japan's, colonial activities in the 19th and 20th centuries are, I think, well behind them. I cannot imagine, first of all, having the ability, in this day and age, to go out and do that sort of colonial adventuring. It just doesn't happen. And Japan is the last place that would do it, because there is a strong sentiment, a strong feeling that the current system benefits them. There's a genuine affection and affinity between these two countries. If anything, the Japanese have a public diplomacy long-term plan to keep America friendly and to keep in the center of the American focus, the radar screen, that they don't want the US looking elsewhere and seeing other interesting, they want to keep Japanese primacy in the US alliance system. And they do that in a whole variety of ways, both economically and diplomatically and politically. And one of the things that they do, just a very small example of this kind of behavior, Japan has a program, a government program they've been running since the late 80s called the JET program, J-E-T, Japan Exchange and Teaching. The idea is to bring native English speakers to Japan in very large numbers, pay them a reasonably okay wage, spread them throughout the entire country, and have them teach English for a year in junior high schools and high schools, okay? The idea, the sales pitch was, well, we're gonna have living English brought into our classrooms and kids are gonna have better English skills. Since the late 80s, that has not happened. The Japanese overall education system, English education system hasn't improved markedly. But what has improved is when stuff happens to Japan, they have a whole cadre, a whole cohort, phalanx of pro-Japan people in the native English-speaking world, because they don't not only bring Americans, they bring Australians and New Zealanders and British, and now they do this also with Germans and French and other languages. They have a whole bunch of citizen ambassadors who actually literally rise up and, like, they're sleeper cells, if you will. They don't think about Japan for years. And then when something happens in the Japan relationship, these people rise up and they actually start to become activists. I can't think of another country that has such a program. And I saw it in 2011 when Japan had that big earthquake followed by the tsunami and the nuclear disaster. And all of a sudden, all these grassroots organizations all over the world were collecting money and sending it to Japan. Japan's an industrialized democracy. They're pretty good at handling disaster stuff on their own. And yet, they had this incredible outpouring of support and affection. And it was basically all these people who had, and not all of them, but a lot of them had spent time in Japan on the JET program. I know a guy who is he's a high altitude medicine specialist at Mass General Hospital in Boston. So he's used to working in really, really difficult conditions. And he had been on the JET program, and he hadn't thought about Japan for decades. And like the next day, he was on a plane at his own expense to go to Japan and find a car and drive up to the disaster zone and basically just start helping people in hospitals locally and in clinics locally. And there were a bunch of people who did stuff like that. So that was just, I've never seen anything like that.
Thank you very much, Ted.
Thank you. You guys have been great. Thank you so much.
The East Asia region is so incredibly important to the future. It's very important to the U.S., to our continued prosperity, and I appreciate your bringing it into focus tonight. So.